Dr. Henson, thanks for taking some time out to talk with us.
It's great to be back, Ashley.
You know, anytime we talk about a poll, I want to start off by talking about the methodology. What did you guys do this time around?
So we did what we've done, pretty much since 2008. We looked at the attitudes of 1,200 registered voters, collected data over the internet, but using YouGov, kind of the gold standard for using the internet to poll. We were in the field collecting data from in basically the middle of April, I think about the 11th to the 22nd, I think were the exact dates.
Yeah. We're still a ways off from November, but how's that presidential matchup? How's that presidential race looking?
Well, it's looking a lot like we might expect in terms of looking at the history of where presidential election results have been in Texas for the last few years. So we did two different what we call trial ballots where we put President Biden, former President Trump in the field with three other candidates, independent and third-party candidates. And then we did one head-to-head, just Biden and Trump. And they came out pretty close to the same.
Not surprising for Texas.
No, I mean, if you think, the last election, former President Trump won Texas by about 5.5 points. So it's a little more space, but, I appreciate you starting out saying it's April. I mean, nobody should expect that any polling they've seen to date is going to be predictive of what we see on Election Day. That said, we see some things that explain why the gap is a little bit bigger than we saw last time. President Biden not running as well among independents or among Latinos as he did as he was doing at this point in the last election. So he's lost a little ground. Some of that has to do maybe with changes in attitudes of those groups. Some of it has to do with just being the incumbent president and, people blaming you when things are not going right in their view.
All right. Were there any specific issues you think that led Texans to give former President Trump the lead that he had over Biden in that matchup?
Well, I mean, I think part of this is a very familiar story in the sense that for most Republican voters, border security and immigration are the most important issues facing the state. And they give President Biden very low ratings on that, as do independents. And his border security immigration ratings are not great among Democrats. So there's that. The overriding issue is the economy. What we're seeing in attitudes in Texas is what we're seeing nationally. And that is that even though the Biden administration keeps telling people the economy is good, and economists keep saying the economy is good, we have most people seeing rising prices and inflation, which and the fight against reducing inflation has stalled a little bit. And people, it's been a generation or two since we've seen inflation and rising prices, and people are telling us in the data that they're really noticing that.
One of the things I thought was interesting was some of the concerns and the lack of concern that Texans have about some of the candidates. Specifically, when we look at President Biden, Democrats concerned about his age.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important a little bit to set up how we did this. So we asked people after they made their choices in those trial ballots, do you have any concerns about your candidate? And gave them just what we call an open-ended response. They could just tell us what they thought. More Democrats had concerns about President Biden than Republicans had concerns about former President Trump. And among those Democrats who had concerns about President Biden was overwhelmingly about his age or some related aspect of his health. Way more than half of Democrats who had concerns said that was their top concern. Much more of a spread with President Trump. Only 7% of Republican voters that had concerns said that they were concerned about President Trump's age, even though he's only a few years younger than President Biden. The most common concern, and it was only in the low double digits that Republicans expressed, was about President Trump's legal troubles, but that was only, in the teens. So the concerns were spread out and at a much lower level among Republicans. Overwhelming concern among Democrats is President Biden's age and his health.
Well, let's switch gears and talk about another race, and that is the race for the U.S. Senate. U.S. Senator Ted Cruz facing off against Congressman Colin Allred. We know who's raising the most money out of this race, but in the polling, something different.
Yeah, right now, we found Ted Cruz leading Colin Allred by double figures. I mean, I think the gap is around 14 points in that neighborhood. And I think it's fair. I mean, I'm sure I've not gotten the email yet, but I'm sure the Allred campaign is going to be quick to point out there's other polling that shows that race closer, more
right.
Single digits. And I think part of this is substantive and part of this is a matter of how you interpret the polling and looking at how polls are being done. So in our poll, we don't, right now we're just polling registered voters. We're not asking people whether they're likely to vote. And when people tell us that they don't have a choice, we leave it at that for now because it's too early in our view to force people, to say, no, really, who would you vote for? Please, if you had to. It's just, the election is too far in the future. Other polls are either forcing a choice or they're trying to figure out what a likely voter is. And I think it's most of those polls where you're seeing the race a little tighter. And I think that makes sense. But we're seeing that, the main problem here for Colin Allred is that there's still a lot of undecided Democrats. About 15% of Democrats said that they didn't really know who they were going to vote for. In another measure of his favorability, about 30% didn't have a view of him. So I think part of what we're seeing here is the fallout from Colin Allred's success in some ways in the primary. The Democratic primary had very low turnout. He campaigned like an incumbent the whole time, and that race just didn't engage a lot of Democrats. It worked for Colin Allred, make no mistake about that. He avoided a runoff in a crowded field. But I think some of the fallout is that a lot of Democrats are just not paying attention to that race yet.
Yeah, certainly will be interesting to see how that shakes out. You alluded to this earlier, but you asked Texans again what they think is the most important issue facing the state. It's a very familiar issue.
It is. Immigration and border security dominate that list. And, what I would say is that there are some things that are very familiar about that, but there are also some things to watch in those numbers. The familiar thing is, as we've said, nothing unifies Republicans in their attitudes or grabs their attention like immigration and border security. So, about 60% of Republicans tell us immigration and border security, most important problem facing the state. The less familiar thing is that we're seeing the share of Democrats who say that inching up, not a lot, but inching up from, an average of maybe 6 through 8 in the previous year to more like between 12 and 14 in the last couple of polls that we've done. Not a huge increase, but at a time when Democrats and Republicans are looking for issues to campaign on that divide their opponents or might peel off a little bit of support, makes what was already a good issue for Republican candidates an even better one if this trend among Democrats continues.
And yet one of the things that we're seeing Democrats kind of hold on to, particularly when we're looking at the presidential election and what President Biden, he's trying to draw a lot of attention to abortion and reproductive rights.
Right.
And that's not necessarily resonating as a top concern among Texans.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I think when we ask about the most important problem facing Texas in a kind of general sense, we don't get a lot of Democrats saying that that's their main issue. It moves, between 8 and 10% Democrats, but that's nothing compared to these numbers that we see in border security. And it's crowded out a little by the economy. But I would say that in our last poll in February, when we asked a similar question, but we asked Democrats, what are you thinking about going into the primary elections? And Democrats' criticism of Republicans is kind of off the table, and they're just telling us what they're thinking about in terms of just their vote in a primary election. The share that say that abortion is a big issue for them, more than doubles. So I think it's something a little bit context dependent about this, and I think that that we're not picking up in that general kind of question about the most important problem. That said, even if abortion is a pretty good issue for Democrats, it has nowhere near the unifying impact at least as of now, that the border does for Republicans.
And that's one of the things I always think is interesting when you look at this polling. Republicans generally really rally behind the border and border security being an issue. Democrats are way more split. There's not a 60%, of Democrats think one thing is the most important issue for the state.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that if you're a Democratic candidate in this election cycle, you have a real challenge on that front. Now, that doesn't mean that abortion is still not, relatively speaking, a pretty good issue for Democrats, in part for the same reason that border security has some added bonuses for Republicans. What I mean by that is if you start looking more closely at Republican attitudes on abortion are very split, and they're not nearly as extreme as the policies that Republicans can be identified with right now, both in the state and at the national level because of Dobbs. We're obviously seeing a very vigorous, fights within the Republican Party over how to position in that. But I think it is a benefit that as we get closer to the election, Democrats can potentially leverage a little bit more.
Yeah. The one thing, Republican, Democrat, Independent, everyone's feeling it when it comes to the economy.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in your polling is you found 68% of registered voters say they are very concerned about the price of food and consumer goods. That is a very large number.
Yeah, and it aligns with what we were saying earlier to the extent that, whatever the economy is doing in the numbers, and that Democrats and in particular the Biden administration are trying to, campaign on and say we've got economic growth, we've got, great employment. When you ask people about different components of the economy, they are really noticing rising prices. And, for that reason, the recent kind of stalling out, if you will, that we've seen in the reduction in the inflation rate, pretty bad for the administration, not good political news.
All right. Interesting data. Going to be excited to see when you guys do the next poll.
We appreciate you paying attention to the work, and I love being here.
Well, thanks so much for your time.
You're welcome. Great to see you.